Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to learn how to implement authentication in a Node.js application using a middleware called Passport.js. Passport.js provides a simple and consistent way to implement user authentication across different strategies, enabling developers to easily integrate various authentication mechanisms into their applications. You can find Passport.js complete documentation and examples by visiting their official website, which is passportjs.org. And click on documentation on the left side. You can check some tutorials about creating strategies, for example, signing in with a username and password, signing in with Google or Facebook, but it also have for Apple, GitHub, LinkedIn, and other social media platforms. Email magic link, and many other strategies which you can find by clicking on strategies options here on the left as well. So currently Passport have 539 strategies. You can check each one of them here and click to see the documentation on how to implement this strategy on your Node.js application. We're going to build a simple REST API with registration, login, logout, and Google Authentication endpoints, implementing the Passport, local, and Google OAuth strategies. We're going to use sessions on the backend and cookies on the front end. And we're going to test the API with Postman and also on a simple React app just to see how everything works on the front end. If you want to learn more about REST APIs, there's a playlist here on the channel where we cover the fundamentals of REST API with explanations and examples, how to use REST APIs with databases, and also how REST API authentication works using JWT. I'll leave the playlist link on the description below. So let's get started on coding. I'll be using VS Code for this tutorial, but feel free to use any other code editor you like. I have an empty folder here on VS Code called auth with Passport.js. First, let's create our Node app by opening the terminal here on the top and type npm init, and I'll add the flag -y to automatically generate a package.json file with default values. Okay, project created, and we have a new package.json file with details of our application, and we can modify this whenever we need. Now let's install the dependencies we're going to use for now, and later we'll install more dependencies along the tutorial. So back on the terminal, let me clear, and I'll type npm install, and we're going to use Express to handle HTTP requests and manage middlewares. And since we're going to use sessions on our app, so let's install Express-session so we can easily manage sessions with Express. And we're not going to use any database, but we can use something to simulate our tables or collections. So we can use a dependency called NEDB. This will allow us to simulate tables or collections easily, providing a simple way to store and query our data in a lightweight file-based format. But to use async and await with promises, we can use the NEDB-promises dependency. And the Passport dependency, and we need to install the Passport strategies separately. Since we're going to implement username and password authentication, we can use the local strategy. So passport-local to integrate easily with our existing users inside the database. In our case, the NEDB promises module. And when we register our users, the password must be hashed before storing in the database. For that, we can use bcrypt dependency. Okay, that's it for now. Soon we'll install more dependencies. Okay, dependencies installed, and we can check here inside the package.json file under the dependencies object. Still inside the package.json file, note that we have a property called main on the top pointing to an index.js file. This will be the entry point of our Node.js application. So we need to create this file on our application. I'll create here on the root, so new file called index.js. Inside this file, let's start by importing the dependencies we'll be using. So let's start with Express. So I'll add a new const here, call Express equals to require Express. Now let's import the Express session dependency. So const, I'll call this session equals to require Express session. Let's import Passport. So const passport equals to require passport. And let's import the bcrypt as well. So const bcrypt equals to require bcrypt. Okay, now let's initialize Express. So I'll create a new const, call app equals to Express function. Now we need to configure Express to accept JSON data from the client. So I'll call here app.use method, and inside I'll call express.json middleware. Next, since we're going to use sessions, so let's configure the Express session dependency inside Express. So I'll call again app.use, and inside I'll call the session, we import it on the top, and we can configure some properties inside an object. So let's set up the minimal configuration. We need to start working with Express session. So I'll start with the secret property. This is a string used to sign the session ID cookie, providing security for session data. So this secret is up to you. It's like a password. So I'll just add something like my-session-secret. Okay, next we need to set the resave property, which is a boolean indicating whether to save the session back to the session store, even if it wasn't modified during the request. Commonly set to false. Don't worry about this property for now. We need to set this by default. And the last property we need to set is the save uninitialized property, which is also a boolean that determines whether to save uninitialized sessions. This means new sessions that have not been modified. Commonly set to false as well, to avoid storing empty sessions. There are many other important properties we can set here, but for now this is the basic configuration that we need. If you want to learn more about sessions and cookies authentication, there is also a video here on the channel where I explain in depth how this type of authentication works and other properties we can set on the Express session configuration. I'll leave the video link on the description below. Okay, next, let's initialize Passport inside Express. So I'll call app.use, and inside I'll call the Passport dependency we imported .initialize method. And we need to configure Passport to use sessions. For that, I'll call again app.use, and inside I'll call passport.session method. Great, last, let's start our Express server by calling app.listen method, and inside the first parameter is the port number, so I'll add 3000 for example. And the second parameter is a callback function, so if everything works, let's show a message on the console. So console.log, and I'll print something like server started on port 3000. Now let's run our Node.js application just to see if everything is working. So back on the terminal, let me clear. Let's run the index.js file. So I'll type node index.js or just index and hit enter. Great, server started, and we can see the message server started on port 3000. Now, every time we change something on our app and save, we need to stop our server here on the terminal by pressing Ctrl+C and run again the node index command. To avoid doing this every time we change something, let's install a dependency called nodemon to do this for us automatically, so we don't need to worry about restarting the server. So I'll type npm install nodemon, and we're going to use this dependency during development. We don't need to install in production. So to set this as a development dependency, I'll add the -- save -dev flag, hit enter. Okay, nodemon is installed, and we can check here inside the package.json file under the dev dependencies object. So when we move our application to production, we only need to install the dependencies and not the dev dependencies. These are only used during development. Now to start our application using nodemon, still here on the package.json file, we have a property called scripts. Let me remove this test script from here, and I'll add a new script called start. And instead of running our application using node index, now we need to run with nodemon index. Let's test all this. So back on the terminal, I'll clear, and let's run the start script we just created by typing npm and the name of the script, which is start. And perfect, server started on port 3000, and now NodeMon will be watching for changes on our application and restart the server automatically for us. Great. Now let's configure any DB promises to simulate our users table. So I'll create a new folder here on the root, called services. And inside, I'll create a new file called database.js. So inside this file, let's start by importing the AnyDB promises dependency. So I'll add a new const, and I'll call this data store, just like on the documentation, equals to require AnyDB promises. So AnyDB will create .db files to store our users. So I'll add a new const here called users equals to the data store we imported .create method. And inside we need to configure where and the name of the file that will store our users. So I'll add / to create on the root of our project, and let's call this file users.db. Okay, now we need to export the users constant here so we can use in other files whenever we need to access our users. So I'll call module.export equals to an object with the users constant inside. And that's all. Now back on the index.js file, let's import our database file so we can have access to the users. So above the express initialization, I'll add a new constant here with an empty object equals to require / and we're going to select the services folder / select the database file. And inside the object here, let's extract the users constant. Okay, now let's create our first route to register users and save on our users.db file. I'll create all the routes here on the index.js file, but in a real application, it's a good practice to create these routes in a separate file. So this is just for learning purposes. So I'll call app dot, and this is a post route because the client will send data, and we'll call this route / register. The next parameter is the function that the route will execute. So I'll add async, the request and response parameters from express. So request is everything the client will send to the server, and response is what the server needs to send back to the client, responding to that request. And inside this route, so the client will be sending the user's email, which is going to be used to log in as the username, and also a password, and let's add a name as well. So I'll create a new constant with an empty object. So here we'll extract the name, email, and the password, and we're going to extract all these properties from inside the request parameter .body. Okay, next I'll add a try block and a catch block with an error parameter inside. So if an error occurs, we can grab and handle this error inside the catch block. When that happens, let's return a response to the client informing something went wrong. So I'll call the response parameter dot, and let's send a status of 500, which means internal server error. And let's also send a JSON response with an object and a error property saying something like something went wrong. Now inside the try block, let's add some validations here to check if the client is sending the name, email, and password. So I'll add an if statement here, and I'll add an exclamation sign, the name constant we're extracting on the top, and an OR operator, exclamation sign again, email, or again, exclamation sign, password. So if the name or email or the password is not being sent, let's return a validation error response to the client. So I'll add return to not execute any code after this line, the response parameter dot status, and let's send the 422, which is unprocessable entity, and it means that the server recognizes the request format but cannot process due to issues with the data, such as validation errors or inconsistencies. And a JSON response as well with the error property, and let's add something like name, email, and password are required. Of course, in a real application, you should add a better validation here, maybe using dependencies like Joy, Express Validator, and others. Next, we need to check if the email is already being used by another user, because since the email will be used to log in, it has to be unique. And we're going to search for the email inside our users DB file. So I'll add another if statement, and I'll call await directly here, and I'll call the users constant from inside our database file, dot, and we're going to use the find one method from AnyDB, and inside an object, we can configure the search criteria. So we want to find by the email field, where is equals to the email we extracted from the request body up here. But since the key name is the same as the value name, so we can leave just email here. Okay, so if the email already exists, let's return response.status, and here we can use the 409, which means conflict, and also a JSON response with the error property saying email already in use. Okay, that's all the validations we need for this route, and now we need to insert the new user details on the users DB file. But first, we need to hash the password using the bcrypt dependency. So I'll create a new constant called hashed password equals to await the bcrypt dependency dot hash method, and the first parameter is the password that we extracted from the request body here, and the second parameter is the salt, so I'll add 10, which is the most used one. Okay, now let's insert the new user. So I'll create a new constant, call new user equals to await the users constant dot, and we can use the insert method from AnyDB, and inside an object we can add the name field, which is equals to the name that we extracted from the request body. But again, since the key and value has the same name, so we can leave just name here. And we also want to add the email field, same from up here. And for the password field, we need to send the hashed password that we created up here containing the encrypted password. Okay, if everything goes well, let's return a message to the client. Since this will be the last line inside the try block, so we can call the response parameter directly without the return. Dot status, and we're going to use the 201, which means created, and also a JSON response. And here we're going to send the ID property, which is equals to the new user constant. And whenever we insert a new resource inside AnyDB using the insert method, AnyDB automatically create an underscore ID field, which is like a primary key for the resource. So let's return this underscore ID field, and also the name that we're also going to grab from the new user constant dot name, and the email also equals to the new user dot email. And we should never return sensitive information to the client, like the password, for example. And that's all for the register route. So let's test this on Postman, but feel free to test in any other HTTP testing tool. So I'll open a new request tab here on the top, and the URL, let's add http column / localhost and port 3000 / register, which is the name of the route. And let's change the method here to post. Now we need to send the new user data on the request. For that, I'll open the body tab and select the raw option. The type here on the end, I'll leave as JSON. And on the content, I'll add an object with the name property. So let's add John Doe, for example. And the email, I'll add jd@domain.com. Just a simple email. And for the password, I'll add something very simple as well, like 123456. Now we can click on send. Great, we got the 201 created status code and the new user details on the response body. Note that we didn't send back the password here, just the ID, name, and the email. Now, if we check on the code, note that there is a new users DB file here on the root with the new user we just added, and note that the password is encrypted here, so that simple password became this weird string. And here on the end, AnyDB created this underscore ID, which is a unique ID simulating a primary key field. Awesome. Now we can create the login route and implement the passport local strategy. So let me open the index.js file, and below the register route, let me collapse here. I'll call app dot, and this will be also a post route. And the name, let's add /login with the async, request, and response parameters, arrow function. And inside here, we'll need to configure a passport callback, but first we need to implement the local strategy. So I'll implement this on a separate file, and we'll call inside the login route here. So here on the services folder, I'll add a new file, and I'll call this passport.js. And inside this file, we'll import and configure the local strategy. First, we'll check if the user email exists, if the password matches, and also configure the user inside the session. Later, we'll import and configure the Google strategy that we haven't installed yet. So I'll start by importing the passport dependency. So const passport equals to require passport. And we also need to import the passport local strategy dependency. So const, and I'll call this local strategy in camel case equals to require passport dash local. And here on the end, we need to call dot strategy, which is a class. Okay, great. And since we need to check if the password the client is sending matches with the encrypted password on the database, so we must import the bcrypt as well. So const bcrypt equals to require bcrypt. Okay, now we need to import our users constant we created on the database.js file to have access to the users DB file. So const object equals to require // the services folder, and select the database.js file. And here inside the object, let's extract the users constant. Great, now let's configure our passport local strategy. So I'll call passport.use method, and inside, since the local strategy we imported up here is a class, we need to add a new instance of this local strategy. So I'll call new local strategy. And inside, the first parameter is an options object, and we can set some properties here. For example, this username field. So passport is going to look for the username and password fields on the request body inside the login route. But our username field is actually the email field. So we can tell passport that the username field property is actually the email field. And by default, it will look for a password field. But we can also set a different field name for the password as well by setting the password field property. But let's leave as password, which is the default, so we don't need to set this property. And we can set other properties here like session, which is true by default, but we can change it to false in case we're not using sessions on the backend, for example, when using JSON Web Tokens. But since we're gonna use sessions, let's leave the default, which is true, so we don't need to set this property. And we also have this pass request to callback, which is false by default, in case we need to access the request inside the local strategy. But since we're not going to use it, we can leave the default value, so we don't need to set this property as well. And the second parameter is a function that will need to handle the authentication and validate if the username, which is the email, exists on the database, and then check if the password is correct. So let me add here an async function. And for the parameters, we have the username. But actually, let's set this to email because we're using email instead of username. And then the password. And last, we have a callback function that we need to call whenever we're done with all the validations and the authentication is complete. So I'll call this done, for example. But the name of these parameters is up to you. And all this might seem a little confusing for now, but don't worry, it will make sense once we start using this strategy inside the login route. Okay, so inside this function, I'll add a try block and a catch block with an error parameter here. So if there's an error, what we need to do is call the done callback parameter. And inside here, we can send 3 parameters. The first parameter is an error if there is one. The second parameter is the user object, or we can send false if something wrong happened and we don't have the user yet. And the third parameter is options we want to send to the login route, like some validation error or some extra details we want to handle inside the login route. So here inside the done callback parameter, I'll just send the error parameter here from inside the catch block parameter, and the rest of the parameters we don't need to send because we don't have a user and we don't want to send any options or details, so we can leave just the error here. And inside the try block, first thing we need to do is find inside our database for the user that has the same email here from the function parameter. So I'll create a new const called user equals to await, and I'll call our users DB file that we imported on the top. And we can use the find one method. And inside here, we'll find by the email field, which is equals to the email parameter from up here. But again, since the key name is the same as the value name, so we can leave just one email here. Next, we'll add a validation here, checking if there is a user with this email. So I'll add an if statement, add an exclamation sign, and check if the user is empty or undefined. If it is, we need to call the done callback parameter to handle inside the login route. So I'll call return to stop the execution here, the done callback parameter. So we could send an error here for the first parameter, but what I typically like to do is only send an error here if it's a server error. That means something went wrong on the backend. Since this is a validation error sent from the client, like a wrong email or an email that doesn't exist, so we could send this validation error on the third parameter, which is the options. And we can handle differently on the login route and send the correct response to the client. So for the first parameter here, I'll send null for the error. And the second parameter, which is the user, I'll send as false because we don't have a user. And for the third parameter, I'll send an object with an error property. So here we could send wrong email or this email doesn't exist, but for a better secure response, we should send something like incorrect, email, or password. So we should send the same error message if the password is incorrect as well. That way the client doesn't know if the email or the password is incorrect, and we're not giving any clues for a malicious client. Okay, so continuing here, if the user does exist with that email, so now we need to check if the password the client is sending matches with the password on the database. For that, we need to use the bcrypt library to compare the passwords, since the password on the database is encrypted. So I'll create a new const here, call isMatch, which is equals to await. The bcrypt dependency we imported, dot, and we can use the compare function. These receive 2 parameters. The first parameter is the raw password. That means the password the client is sending. So we have this password here on the parameter. So password. And the second parameter is the encrypted password from the database, which we have inside the user constant here. So user dot the password field. So if the isMatch returns true, that means the passwords matches. And if the password is incorrect, it will return false. So I'll add an if statement here and check if the isMatch is false. So I'll add an exclamation sign here on the beginning. So if the password is wrong, we can return and call the done callback function. Actually, I'll copy the same response if the email is incorrect from the validation up here. Okay, and paste inside here. So if the password is wrong, we're sending the options parameter with the message saying incorrect email or password. Okay, continuing here. If the user exists and the password matches, we can call the done callback parameter. So I'll send null for the error parameter. And for the second parameter, we can send the user constant containing the user details, and we don't need to send any extra options on the third parameter. Great, now that we set the local strategy, it's important to understand how Passport manages user sessions. When a user logs in successfully, Passport needs a way to keep track of the user across different requests. So we need to configure two methods inside Passport, which is the serialized user and the deserialized user. These methods are crucial for managing user sessions effectively and ensuring a smooth authentication experience in our application. So below here, let's set the serialized user method first. So I'll call passport.serialize user method. This method is called when a user successfully logs in. It allows us to specify what information should be stored in the session. Typically, we want to store only the user ID on the session. So this method returns a function here with two parameters. The first one is the user object that we want to serialize, which is the same user object we set here on the done callback. And the second parameter is a callback function that we must call when the serialization process is complete. So we can also call this done. Now inside the function, we can call the done callback parameter, which takes two parameters, an error and the user ID. Since this is very simple and we don't want to run any validations here, so we can send null for the error, and for the user ID, we can call the user parameter from up here, _ID, which is saved on the users DB file, and we're setting here on the strategy. Great, that's all for the serialized user method, and we're setting only the user ID on the session. Now we need to set the deserialized user method below here, so I'll call passport.deserialize user method. This method is called on every request after a user logs in. It retrieves the user information based on the ID stored in the session. This way we can access the user's data like their name, email throughout the session without needing to log them in again. So here it also returns a function with two parameters. The first one is the user ID, which we set here on the callback inside the serialized user method. And the second parameter, similar to the serialized user method, is also a callback function. And we can call done as well. So inside here, we need to grab the user details from inside the database by the user ID up here. So now we need the try and the catch blocks with an error parameter here. And inside the catch block, I'll call the done callback parameter. And here we can set two parameters, which is the error and the user object. So for the error, I'll add the error parameter from the catch block. And since we don't have a user object here, so we don't need to set this parameter. And inside the try block, like I said before, we need to get the user details from the database. So I'll create a new constant here, call user, which is equals to await. So we need to add the async here on the function and call the users DB file dot the find one method. And we want to find by the underscore ID field, where it's equals to the user ID parameter from up here that we set inside the session. Now I'll add an if statement here, checking if the user wasn't found, so exclamation user. If not, we can return and call the done callback parameter. So for the error parameter, I'll send a new error, passing something like user not found. Since we don't have a user, we don't need to set the second parameter. Now, if a user was found, we can then return the user details. So I'll call the done callback parameter, set null for the error, and set the user constant for the second parameter here. Great, so we set the serialize and the deserialize user methods. So this process is a little bit tedious, but it's very important to maintain user sessions on our application. Now we need to handle this strategy inside the login route that we created inside the index.js file here. So if we check the Passport documentation here, let me open the strategies option. and type local. Let me open the Passport local strategy docs here. So here it shows how to create the local strategy according to our needs, which is the one we just created. And inside the login route, we need to call as a middleware the passport.authenticate method, passing the strategy we're using. In this case, by default, it's called local. And we can send some extra properties here as a second parameter. And then if everything works, it will fall inside the route itself. But using it like this, we want to have access to the options third parameter that we're sending the validation message here. Because whenever we set the user parameter here as false, Passport will automatically return the 401 unauthorized status code to the client with a simple message saying unauthorized. So before implementing the Passport authenticate method inside the login route, we need to import the Passport.js file. So I'll import above the users db import, and all we need to do is call directly require, and inside / the services folder, and select the Passport file. Now back on the login route, to have access to all parameters and handle our own custom responses to the client, what we can do here is instead of calling the Passport authenticate method as a middleware, we can call directly inside the route. So I'll call the Passport dependency, we imported on the top, .authenticate method, and we want to access the local strategy, and the second parameter is a function with the 3 parameters inside the done callback function here, which is the error, user object, and the options object parameter. So here on the function, I'll add the error, user, and for the options parameter, I'll call info, for example. Great, so first thing we can do is check if there is an error. So I'll add an if statement here, checking if there is an error. If so, we can return the internal server error response to the client. So I'll call return the response parameter .status with the 500 internal server error and a JSON response. And inside the object, we can send an error property. So here we could send directly the error parameter message, but in production we should send a more generic message, like something went wrong, just like we're sending here on the register route inside the catch block. Okay, so if we don't have an error, what we can do now is check if we don't have a user or if it's false. So I'll add another if statement here, the exclamation sign user from the Passport authenticate parameter. So here on our local strategy, every time we're setting the user parameter as false and the error as null, we're sending back the options parameter. So we can send this parameter back to the client with a 401 unauthorized status code. So inside the if statement here, I'll call return response.status, the 401 unauthorized code with a JSON response. And since we're sending an object here on the third parameter with an error property, we can actually send the info parameter here directly. Great, so if everything worked and we have a user, we need to authenticate the user and add inside the session. So we can return a cookie to the client. For that, we can call the request parameter, and Passport offers a login method, which is used to establish a login session for a user. Note that we have 2 login methods, one in lowercase and the other one in camel case. But they're the same method, so I'll choose the one in lowercase. And the login method takes 2 parameters. The first parameter is the user that we want to log in. In our case, we can use the user parameter that the authenticate method is sending back to us here on the parameter, which we set on this strategy. And the second parameter is a callback function that gets called once the login process is complete. And it takes an error parameter. So what we can do inside here is check if there is an error. So if error, then we can send the same error we're returning up here with the 500 status code. So let me copy and paste here. Otherwise, if the login was successful, we can return a success response to the client and send some details from the logged user. So I'll call return response.status. We can use the default success status code, which is 200 OK. and a JSON response with an object containing details of the user. So let's send the ID, which we can get it from the user parameter, dot underscore ID, the name equals to the user, dot name, and the email equals to the user, dot email. The reason why we're not sending the entire user object here, it's because it contains the encrypted password, and it's not secure to send sensitive information to the client, even if it's encrypted. And here on the Passport Authenticate method declaration, we need to call the request and response parameters here from the login route. So Passport can process the authentication and send a response back to the client. This is necessary because Passport is a middleware that needs to access both the request and response to perform the authentication and handle the result correctly. Great, so let's test this new login route on Postman. I'll open a new request tab here, and this is a post method, and the URL is localhost port 3000, but let's replace the register here to login. And here on the body tab, I'll select the raw option. We can leave as JSON type, and the content, I'll add an object with the email property. So remember here on the local strategy, Passport expects an username property, but we informed that the username field should be handled as email. So here we're expecting the client to send as email. And I'll add John Doe's email, which is jd@domain.com. And the password field, by default, Passport expects as password. And we could also change this, but we leave as the default. And it's 123456. Okay, we can click on send. Perfect, we got the 200 OK status code and the ID, name, and email of the user on the response body. And if we open the cookies tab here on Postman, we have a cookie with a value here, which is a unique ID that every request we send to the server, it will verify inside this session for this ID here, which is encrypted with the secret property we added on the Express session dependency configuration. Before we see how the session works on the backend and view what's inside, let's set some validations here. So first, if we send an email that doesn't exist, so for example, I'll add 1 here on the beginning and click on send. We got the 401 unauthorized status code and the error message saying incorrect email or password. Now let's put back the correct email and set a wrong password. So I'll add 7 here on the end and click on send. Great, we got the same status code and the error response as well. So that means it fell inside this if statement here, checking if the user is there and returning the content of the info parameter we set on the strategy. So our login route is working. Now let's create another route to check what's inside the session, and later we'll protect this new route to allow only logged users to access. And below the login route, I'll call app, dot, and this will be a get route. And let's return the details of the logged user on the response of this route. So we can call me, for example, and then the request and response parameters, arrow function, and inside, Passport set the logged user on the session, and we can access by calling the request parameter dot user property. And let me send this as a response to the client. So response dot JSON, and send the request.user just so we can test. So back on Postman, let me open a new request tab, and the method we can leave as get, and the URL is localhost port 3000, and let's replace here to me. And if we click on send, we got the 200 OK status code, but nothing on the response body. That's because every time our server restarts, in our case NodeMon restarted for us, it destroys the session. That's because the session is in memory and it only lives as long as the server is running. If you want to keep the session stored even if the server is down, you can store the session details on a database. On the session authentication video on the description below, I explain how this works, and in production, you should definitely store the session on the database or Redis, for example. So to create the session, we need to log in again. Let me open the login request tab here. And let me remove the 7 here on the end of the password. Okay, click on send. Okay, user is logged, so the session was created on the server. Now, if we call the slash me route again, awesome, we receive the 200 OK status code and the user details on the response body. So it stored a user ID on the session here on the serialized user method, and on every request we have the user details because we're returning here on the deserialized user method from the database. And it's setting on the request parameter the user property. So as you can see, Passport is handling all the session management for us. And like I said before, this whole process is a bit laborious, but Passport ensures a secure way to authenticate users and set on the session. Now let's say we want to protect this route here and ensure that only authenticated users can access. So what we can do is create a middleware function to be called before accessing this route. On the request parameter here, besides the user property, Passport also offers a method called isAuthenticated, which returns true if all process to authenticate a user is complete, and false otherwise. So let's create a middleware function using this method, but I'll create this on a separate file. So here on the root, I'll create a new folder called middlewares, and inside a new file called auth.js, for example. So here I'll create a function that verifies if the user is authenticated by checking the isAuthenticated method from Passport. If so, the user can proceed to the route itself. And we need to export this function so we can use inside the index.js file. So I'll call here exports dot, and let's call this function ensure authenticated, for example. And this is equals to, so as a middleware, we'll have access to the request and response parameters from the route. And we also have access to a parameter called next that we need to call to go to the next middleware or to the route itself. And inside here, I'll add an if statement and check if the request.isAuthenticated method is true. That means the user is logged and the session is set. If so, we can then return and call the next parameter method to access the route. Otherwise, here on the bottom, if the user is not logged, then we need to return an authorized response to the client. So I'll call response.status with the 401 unauthorized status code and a JSON response with an error property saying something like you must be authenticated to access this resource. Okay, now back on the index.js file, let's import this ensure authenticated function we just created here on the top. So I'll add below the usersdb file import, so const, and I'll add an empty object equals to require, and inside / middlewares folder, and select the auth.js file. And inside the object, we can extract the ensure authenticated function. Now inside the get me route, before the request and response parameters, we can call the ensure authenticated middleware function. So when we return the next parameter on the middleware function, it will fall here inside the route function. So here let's return the user details to the client, and we have inside the request.user property. But since we have also the password inside the object, let's send an object with the ID equals to request.user._ID and the name equals to the request.user.name, and let's add the email as well equals to the request.user.email. Let's keep it simple like this, but we could return only the ID, name, and email directly here inside the deserialized user method. So it's up to you which details you want to return from the user in every request. Okay, let's test all this on Postman. Since we made changes to our project and save, NodeMon restarted the server. That means we no longer have a logged user. So if we try to call the get me route here, let me click on send. We got the 401 unauthorized status code and the error on the response saying you must be authenticated to access this resource. That's because it fell inside the ensure authenticated middleware function we just created. Now let's open the login request here and click on send. Great, user is logged in. Now let's call the me route again. Great, we got 200 OK status code and the ID, name, and email of the user that is currently authenticated. Awesome. So in every protected route that requires the user to be logged, we can set the ensure authenticated middleware function. Perfect. Now we need a route to log out the user. What that route should do is remove the current logged user ID from the session and send a response to the client or guides the user to the next appropriate step, like redirecting to another route, for example. So let's create this new route below the login route. So I'll call app dot, and since the client won't send any data to this route, so we can add as a get method, and we'll call this route /logout, and we'll add the request and response parameters, arrow function, and inside we can call the request parameter dot, and passport offers a method called logout that already take care of everything for us. Note that we also have logout all in lowercase and in camel case as well. But just like the login, they're the same, so I'll select the one in lowercase. And this method returns a callback function with an error parameter in case something went wrong. So inside this function, we can add an if statement and check if there's an error. If so, we can return response.status, the 500 internal server error with a JSON response, and an error property with a message saying something went wrong. All error parameters that we have, we should store inside a log file or other log system, so only developers can have access to it and not send back to the client. Okay, if everything goes well with the logout, then here on the bottom, we can send a success response to the client. So I'll call response.status, and here we can use the 204 no content status code, which means the request was successful, but we don't have anything to return back to the client. And here on the end, instead of calling the JSON method, we can call the send method. Great. Now let's test this new route on Postman. So I'll open a new request tab here, and we can leave this as a get method, and the URL is localhost port 3000, and let's replace here to logout. And before executing, let's make sure the user is not authenticated yet by calling the get me route. Okay, we got the 401 status code and the error you must be authenticated to access this resource. Now let's authenticate the user by calling the login route. Great, user is logged. Now let's just test the get me route again. Great, everything is working. Now let's call the new logout route. Click on send. Awesome, we got the 204 no content status code and nothing on the response body. Now if we try to call the me route again, click on send. Great, we got the 401 status code, and again the error you must be authenticated to access this resource. Perfect, so the entire authentication process using Passport local strategy is working. And until now we only use Postman to test our API. But let's test on a React application just to see how everything works, and we'll need to add some extra configurations on our backend API. So here we have a very simple React app with a login page and a home page. And on the app file, I created two routes using React router down dependency. So /login redirects the user to the login page, and just / to the home page. On the login page, we are handling a div with an h1 element inside saying login, and a form with two inputs. Let me just hide the explorer here. So one input is for the email and the other one is for the password, and we're setting a state for each field here on the top whenever we change the input's content, and a submit button saying login that when we click it submits the form, calling the onSubmit event, passing the handle login function, which simply calls the login endpoint that we created on the backend using Axios dependency, passing the email and password from the state on the request body. And note that we are setting the with credentials property from Axios to true. This property allows Axios to send cookies and authentication data with cross-origin requests. And if everything works, we're showing a simple alert saying login successful, welcome, and the name of the user, which we are returning on the response of the login endpoint. And then we are redirecting the user to the home page using the use navigate from the React router down dependency. And here on the catch block, if something goes wrong, if it returns a 401 or a 500 status code, we are checking if there is an error on the response. Otherwise, we are showing login fail on a simple alert. And on the home page, we are rendering a div, also with an h1 element saying home, a paragraph that shows a message state here, which we're going to see in a bit. And here we have a state called is authenticated, that if it's set to true, that means the user is logged. Then it renders a logout button, otherwise nothing is rendered. And on the use effect hook, that means when the page finishes loading, we are calling a function called fetch protected route, which basically calls our get me route, passing the with credentials property set to true, and if it returns a success response, we are setting the message state to welcome and the name of the user, which we're also returning on the response for the me route. And then setting the is authenticated state to true, which by default is false here on the top. On the catch block, we're just checking if there's an error on the response. If not, we're returning something went wrong, setting the error on the message state to show in the paragraph, and setting the is authenticated to false just to make sure the user is not logged. Of course, in a real application, you might want to consider saving the authentication status as a global state, maybe using the React API context or something like Redux or Zistan, for example, but this is just for learning purposes. And here we have a handle logout function that is being called on the logout button, here on the click event, which simply calls the logout endpoint, setting the is authenticated back to false and redirecting the user back to the login route using the use navigate. And like I said before, this is just for learning purposes. We're not setting any state management here, not even CSS. Just something simple so you can see how the communication between our backend API and the React frontend application. So this React app is running on port 3001. And just to make sure it's running, let me open the terminal here on the top. Okay, compiled successfully. So let's run this on the browser. Let me open a new tab here and type localhost port 3001. Okay, so when we try to access the home page, it returns something went wrong and not the unauthorized error. So if we check here on the console, it shows this HTML HTTP request error saying that the localhost port 3001 has been blocked by CORS policy when we try to call the API's me route. So CORS means cross-origin resource sharing, is a mechanism that allows a server to control which domains are permitted to access its resources. Since our React app is running on a different host on port 3001 and the server is running on port 3000, we need to configure our server to enable safe cross-origin resource sharing to our React app. So back on our backend project, we need to install a dependency called CORS to enable this. So I'll open the terminal and stop the server by pressing Ctrl+C and let me clear. And I'll type npm install CORS. Great, CORS is installed. And let's configure inside the index.js file here. So first thing we need to do is to import the CORS dependency we just installed. So below bcrypt here, I'll add a new const, call CORS, equals to require CORS. Now we need to configure CORS inside Express. So below the Express JSON configuration, I'll call app.use the CORS dependency. And we need to configure some properties inside an object. And the first property, since we're expecting cookies from the client, remember inside Axios, we're setting the with credentials property to true. So we need to set the credentials property to true. This allows the server to accept and include credentials such as cookies, HTTP authentication tokens, and other sensitive data with cross-origin requests. And we can also configure which domains can access our API by setting the origin property. Here we can set one domain or multiple domains inside an array. And if we add a star here, that means it allows requests from any domain. So let's just enable access to our React app domain, which is http :// localhost and port 3001. Okay, let's run our app again. So back on the terminal, I'll run the npm start command. Okay, server started. Let me close the terminal. And now if we try to access the home page again, great, we got the you must be authenticated to access this resource error. That means we got a response from the actual me-route middleware returning the 401 status code because we're not logged. So let's try to log in. I'll open the / login route. Okay, let's enter John Doe's credentials here. So the email is jd@domain.com and the password is 123456. Click on login. Great, it shows the alert, login successful, welcome John Doe. Then when we click on OK, we are redirected to the home page, which is calling the me endpoint and it's setting the message to welcome John Doe. And also showing the logout button that when we click, it logs out the user and redirect to the login page. And if we try to access the home page again, we got the you must be authenticated to access this resource message, because John Doe is not logged anymore. So now we configure cores on our backend to allow access from a front-end application running on a different domain, allowing cookies on the requests. Okay, so we only set up the passport local strategy on our application, which is the standard username and password authentication. But we might want to offer other methods to authenticate the user, like Google or other social media platform. And Passport does offers Google, Facebook, Github, LinkedIn, Instagram, and other strategies. So let's implement Passport Google strategy on our application. So if we go here to the Passport website and inside strategies, we can type Google. And let's use this Passport Google OAuth 20, which is the most used one, and it has a very nice documentation here. But I'll explain in details how to implement this strategy. So back on the code. Let's start by installing this strategy. So I'll open the terminal and stop the server by pressing Ctrl+C, clear, and type npm install passport-google-OAuth 20. Okay, dependencies install. Now, before using this strategy, we must register our application on Google Developers Console, because we're going to need to provide some keys to Passport's Google strategy, which are the client ID and the client secret. So let me open a new tab here on the browser and visit console.cloud.google.com. And of course, to access this platform, you must have an account on Google. I'm already logged with one of my personal Google accounts here. So once you log with your account, you should see a page like this one. First thing we need to do is create a project. So we can click here on the top on the select a project drop down. And here we can click on new project on the top. And let's add a name to this project. So I'll add passport-node, for example. And for the location, let's just leave no organization here. Then click on create. Okay, now let's wait for the project to be created. Great, let's select this project here on the drop down, passport node. Okay, now that the project is selected, we can click on the navigation menu button here on the top left. Then select APIs and Services option and select OAuth consent stream. And here we need to select the user type between the internal type, which is only available for users within our organization, or external type, that means any Google account can access. So let's select the external option and click on create. Now on the app information page, we need to add the app name that the user will see on the page when selecting their Google account. So here I'll just add, for example, manfra.io app, and the user support email, I'll just select the email related to this account project. And we could add a logo here if you want, but I'm not gonna add one. And on the app domain section, the application homepage, this should be the address of our front-end project. That means our React project, which is running locally on port 3001. So I'll add http :// localhost port 3001. Okay, we can continue on the developer contact information section. I'll just add my personal email here. Okay, now click on save and continue. Okay, it's creating our OAuth consent screen. Okay, now we need to add user scopes. That means what permissions our application needs in order to access a user's Google account and data. So we can click on add or remove scopes. And on the dialog here, we want the user email, user profile, and the user Google ID so we can save all this information on our database inside the users DB file. Okay, now scroll down and click on update. Great, so here are all the scopes we selected, and we can click on save and continue. So our project here on Google are not published yet, so the status is set to testing, and we need to make sure that the entire authentication process is working properly before going to production. So in that case, only test users can test the Google authentication on our application. So I'll add a test user here by clicking on add user. And on the dialog, I'll just add another Google personal account here. And click on add. Okay, now click on save and continue. Great, so our OAuth consent screen is complete. And now we need to create our OAuth app to get the client ID and the client secret keys. For that, we can click on credentials here on the left. Then click on create credentials on the top. Then select OAuth client ID. And on the application type drop-down, I'll select web application. And the name, I'll just leave as web client 1, since this is only used to identify the client in the console and will not be shown to end users. Now down here on the authorized JavaScript origin section, we need to add the URL of our front-end React app. So click on add URI, and I'll add http ://localhost and port 3001. Now here on the authorized redirect URI section, so after the user selects its Google account to authenticate, on the backend we need to call a URL to handle the Google strategy. That means receive the user's Google details, save on the database, and then redirect the user to another page or send a success response to the client informing the authentication was successful or not. So I'll click on add URI, and here I'll add our backend API endpoint URL, so http ://localhost, and the backend is running on port 3000, and I'll add, for example, /auth/Google/callback. So we need to create this route on our Node project, and we'll create soon. Okay, now we can click on create. And perfect, here's the client ID and the client secret that we need to pass on the Passport Google strategy inside our code. Now let's configure our Passport Google strategy inside our passport.js file. So first thing we need to do is to import the Passport Google OAuth dependency. So below the local strategy import, I'll add const, and we'll call this Google strategy equals to require the Passport Google OAuth 20. And here on the end, dot strategy class, just like on the local strategy. And let's create the Google strategy below the local strategy here. So I'll call passport.use method, and inside new Google strategy. And for the first parameter, we need to configure some properties inside an object. So the first property is the client ID that we just generated on Google Developer Console. So let me copy the client ID from here and paste inside here. And on a real application, you might want to store the sensitive keys inside a .env file to keep it secure. Since this is just for learning purposes, I'll add directly here. Next, we need to configure the client secret property. Let's go back to the Google Developers Console, copy the client secret, and paste here. And make sure to use your own Google keys, because after the video, I'll be deleting the entire project on Google, consequently the keys as well. Okay, next we need to set the callback URL property. And this is the same URL we added on the console. So let me close this dialog here and open our OAuth by clicking on the web client 1. And it's this authorized redirect URI here. So let me copy and paste inside here. But since we're already running on localhost port 3000, we can leave just the /auth/google/callback. Great. Now for the second parameter, this is a callback function that we're gonna handle all the user details provided by Google. So I'll add async function, and this will return a access token, a refresh token, a profile which contains all details from the user, and just like for the local strategy, we need to call a callback function here when the process is complete. So we can call done as well. Now inside this function, I'll add a try block and a catch block with a error parameter. And inside the catch block here, just like for the local strategy, I'll call the done callback parameter with the error parameter inside. Now inside the try block, so inside the profile here, we need to grab the user's Google ID, name, and email. So we need to check if there is already an user Google ID on our users DB file. If not, we need to insert. So I'll add a new const here, call user, which is equals to await the user's DB file dot define one method. And we'll create a new field on the user's DB file, which we're going to use here on the search criteria. And we can call this Google ID. So if the user registered with an email and password, we won't have a Google ID. And if the user logs with a Google account, so we won't have the password field. And this Google ID here, we're going to grab it from inside the profile parameter here on the function .id. Great. And I'll add an if statement here, checking if the user was found. If so, then we can simply authenticate the user by calling the return done callback function, and then null for the error, and send the user constant we created here to complete the authentication process. Otherwise, let's continue here. If the user wasn't found, we need to insert on the user's DB file. So I'll create a new constant here, call new user equals to await the user's DB file dot insert method, and inside an object we need to set the fields we want to insert. So let's add the new Google ID field, which is equals to the profile parameter dot ID, then the name field, which we can also get it from the profile parameter dot, and it's called display name in camel case. And last, we need the email field, which is also on the profile parameter dot emails, and this is an array that we need to grab the first, and it might be the only email returned. So I'll add 0 index here, so we're getting the first email on the array dot value. Great, that's it. Now we need to authenticate this new user. We insert it by calling the done callback function, set null for the error, and the new user constant containing the details of the new user. Perfect. So we just configure our Google strategy. Now we need to pay attention in a few important details here. For example, imagine that a user has registered to our application using the traditional email and password and later chooses to log in via Google OAuth. So you'll need to handle this situation carefully to link their existing account with the Google OAuth account. This ensures that the user can authenticate with Google without losing any of their previous data or accounts. Same can happen the other way around. The user had already authenticated with Google and later decide to register using the email and password. In that case, you must implement a functionality for the user to verify its email before proceeding with the complete registration. Another approach we can do is create a totally different user, which is what we're doing here. Even if the Google email is already registered, we are not checking if it exists, we are only checking if the Google ID exists. If not, we are creating another user. So it's up to you or your team to decide which approach to follow and which functionalities to implement. Okay? Now on the index.js file, we need to create two new routes here. The first one is when the user decided to log in with Google, we need to redirect the user to Google's OAuth page so he can choose its account. And another route, that is the callback route that we configure inside Google Developers Console. So above the logout route here, I'll create the route to redirect the user to Google OAuth page. So I'll call app dot, and this is a get route. And for the name, let's add /auth/Google. And Passport already handled this for us, so we can call passport.authenticated middleware. And now we're gonna use the Google strategy. And for the second parameter, we can configure some properties inside an object, but the only property we'll configure is the scope property, which is equals to an array of permissions that our application is requesting from the user. So here we can set the profile and the email. And that's it. So we need to call this route from inside our React app logins page. So first let me run our application here. So I'll open the terminal and type npm start. Okay, server started. Let me close the terminal. Now let me open our React app here, and inside the login.js file, below the form element, I'll add a br element here to insert a line break, and I'll add a link element with the content saying login with Google, and inside I'll add an href attribute pointing to the route we just created on the index.js file. So http column / localhost port 3000 /auth /Google. Okay, let's test. So I'll open the browser and our React app here, then go to the login page. Okay, here's the link. Now when we click, perfect, we are redirected to the Google OAuth page to select a Google account. Note that our application name is shown here, manfred.io app. Then I'll select the account I added on the test users page. Remember, on the Google Developers Console, we added a test user. Okay, it will show this confirmation page, so we can click on continue. And it called the callback route that we need to create next. So this is why we got this error here. So back on the index.js file, let's create this callback route below the auth Google route. So app dot, and this is also a get route. And the name we added is /auth /Google /callback. And as a middleware, we need to call the passport authenticate as well. So passport.authenticate, the Google strategy. And just like before, we can configure some properties inside an object. So if something wrong happened, for example, we can create an error page and redirect the user to this page by setting the failure redirect property. But since we don't have a page, we can set it to false. And then we can access the route itself, so we can add the request and response parameters, arrow function. Let me hide the Explorer here. And inside this new route, if everything works here inside our Google strategy and the user is authenticated, that means the session was created. In that case, we can simply redirect the user to the home page. So I'll call the response parameter dot redirect, and inside I'll call the home route from our React app. So http column / localhost and port 3001. Great, that's all. So let's test on the browser. Let me access the React app login page. Okay, click on login with Google. Select the test Google account. Click on continue. And perfect, we are redirected to the home page. And note that I added my name on the Google account I selected. And if we check inside our users DB file, here's the new user we just logged with the Google ID, the name, email, and the underscore ID field, which any DB created automatically. Perfect. And of course, if we click on the logout button, we are redirected to the login page. And if we try to access the home page, it shows the message, you must be authenticated to access this resource. Great. So we learned on this video how to add authentication to our Node application using Passport dependency, and how to implement Passport's local strategy to authenticate with username and password from our database, and how to implement Passport's Google OAuth strategy. We learned how to create a project inside Google Developers Console, how to generate a client ID and client secret so we can configure inside Passport's Google strategy, how to configure cores on our backend API so our front-end React application can access our API securely. And we also learn a little how sessions and cookies works. If you want to learn a different authentication method using JSON Web Tokens, there's a video here on the channel that shows step by step how to implement this type of authentication and how to implement two-factor authentication as well. I'll leave the link on the description below. I'll also leave the GitHub repo link for the backend and the React app on the description as well. Hope this video was helpful to you, and if it was, please click on the like button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.